My name is Alice Rivera, and I am 34 years old. I sacrificed my 20s scrubbing greasy diner floors on the graveyard shift to raise my little brother Leo after our parents passed away. So when I walked into the St. Regis Resort in Park City for his wedding, I expected to feel profound pride. Instead, I found a seating card hidden by the noisy catering kitchen that read, "Poor, uneducated sister living off her brother." The bride's wealthy mother laughed in my face, expecting me to swallow the shame and quietly leave. But then Leo grabbed my hand, looked his billionaire father-in-law in the eye, and told him he just made the costliest mistake of his life. Before I tell you how I dismantled a real estate tycoon in under 48 hours, tell me your age and where you are watching from in the comments below. Welcome to the Revenge Order channel. Hit like and subscribe if you believe true loyalty cannot be bought. The heavy mahogany doors of the Michelin star VIP boardroom remained shut, sealing me inside a pocket of manufactured silence. I sat at the head of the long table, the room wrapped in velvet shadows. In my right hand, I gently swirled a crystal glass of sparkling water, watching the ice clink against the rim. The cut of my tailored obsidian designer suit caught the dim light, projecting a cold, quiet authority. Beyond those thick doors, I could hear the muffled, hurried footsteps of a man who believed he owned the world. He was approaching with the frantic pace of a cornered animal masquerading as a king. He thought he was walking into this exclusive room to secure a $40 million corporate bailout from a mysterious investor. He had no idea he was stepping onto a financial trapdoor, and my hand was resting on the lever. To understand how a former diner waitress ended up holding the executioner's pen for Utah's most prominent real estate tycoon, we must rewind the clock exactly 48 hours. The air inside the St. Regis Resort tasted of imported white roses and old money. Vaulted ceilings stretched toward the snow-capped mountains framing a reception hall, dripping in unearned privilege. Richard and Victoria Sterling, the bride's parents, wanted this wedding to serve as a monument to their own status. Women draped in custom haute couture glided across the polished marble floors, casting sideways glances at anyone who did not fit their strict aesthetic parameters. I stood near the grand entrance, smoothing the fabric of my simple, off-the-rack navy dress. My shoes were unbranded. My jewelry was non-existent. The only item of value on my person was tucked discreetly beneath my sleeve, a matte titanium smartwatch, equipped with encrypted GPS and a direct uplink to a private server. It was a quiet whisper of a life I kept carefully hidden. I was here for one reason. My 26-year-old brother Leo was getting married. I had spent 15 years working exhausting shifts balancing ledgers and sacrificing my own youth so Leo could navigate pre-med without the suffocating weight of poverty on his shoulders. Watching him stand at the altar earlier had been the proudest moment of my life. I approached the polished hostess stand to find my seat. The young woman holding the seating chart offered a practiced, gleaming smile until her eyes swept over my plain dress. Her smile thinned into a tight, strained line. "Name, please?" she asked, her tone shifting from welcoming to wary. "Alice Rivera," I replied, sister of the groom. She traced a manicured finger down her list. A flicker of recognition crossed her features, followed immediately by a gaze of undisguised pity. She did not direct me toward the center of the room, where the crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the Sterling family tables. Instead, she pointed a rigid finger toward the far back corner. "You will be seated just over there, Miss Rivera," she murmured. I followed her gesture. My assigned table was not just in the back. It was pushed deep into the shadows, inches away from the heavy swinging doors of the catering kitchen. The clatter of industrial dishwashers and the shouted orders of the waitstaff bled through the walls. It was a table designed for invisibility. I took a deep breath, letting the blatant alienation wash over me. I assumed this physical isolation was just a petty slight from snobbish in-laws. I prepared to sit in the dark, eat my meal, and watch my brother shine from afar. But as I stepped out of the light and approached my empty seat, I realized the placement of the table was only the foundation of their cruelty. The real poison was waiting on the plate. The table wobbled slightly under the weight of my fingertips. Unlike the grand arrangements near the dance floor, which featured towering displays of cascading white orchids and imported crystal glassware, this small round table bore nothing but a plain white cloth. There was no floral centerpiece. There was no silver cutlery wrapped in linen. It sat in the dim light cast by the swinging kitchen doors, catching the harsh yellow glare every time a hurried waiter pushed through with a tray of cleared plates. A single cheap charger plate rested in front of the only chair. Resting precisely in the center of that plain plate was a pristine white seating card. The edges were embossed with a delicate gold foil. The ink was a deep, rich charcoal swept into elegant, swirling calligraphy. It was the kind of intricate lettering that required time, patience, and specific instruction. I leaned down, expecting to see my name written with the same care afforded to the rest of the guests. Instead, my eyes traced the beautifully crafted letters, forming a sentence that made the breath catch in my throat. Poor, uneducated sister living off her brother. I read the words 3 times. My mind struggled to reconcile the exquisite beauty of the handwriting with the sheer ugliness of the message. My pulse drummed a heavy, rhythmic beat against my ribs. My knuckles turned white as I gripped the edge of the unsteady table. For a fleeting second, I wondered if this was a horrific prank played by a bitter bridesmaid. But the heavy, expensive cardstock matched the wedding invitations perfectly. Someone had paid a professional calligrapher to write this. Someone had approved the proof. Someone had instructed the wedding planner to place it in the darkest corner of the room, far away from the cameras and the smiles. A sharp, shrill laugh shattered the tense silence. It was a sound polished by years of country club luncheons and exclusive charity galas. I turned, slowly releasing my tight grip on the table, forcing my posture straight. Victoria Sterling stood 5 feet away. The bride's mother was a vision of expensive preservation. She wore a tailored emerald gown that draped flawlessly over her frame. A river of conflict-free diamonds rested heavily against her collarbone, catching the dim light and throwing fractured rainbows across the dark painted wall. She held a crystal flute of champagne in one hand, her manicured fingers adorned with rings that cost more than a suburban house. Flanking her were 3 women of similar age and identical posture, their faces stretched into tight, synchronized smirks. "I see you found your designated place," Victoria said, her voice dripping in a sugary sweetness that failed to mask the venom beneath. "I was worried you might wander too close to the front and confuse the photographers. We are filming for a bridal magazine profile, you know." I looked at her, keeping my expression entirely neutral. I had spent a decade negotiating shipping contracts with hardened logistics executives. I knew how to hold my ground against predators. Victoria Sterling was just a different breed of shark, wearing emerald silk instead of a tailored suit. "Did you write this, Victoria?" I asked, my voice steady, betraying none of the fire burning in my chest. She took a delicate sip of her champagne, her eyes gleaming with wicked satisfaction. I ordered it, yes. Consider it a necessary reality check, Alice. My daughter is marrying a brilliant future doctor. Julianne is stepping into a legacy of wealth, status, and prestige. We have senators and hospital board members drinking at the open bar tonight. And then there is you. Her friends exchanged amused glances, leaning in like vultures circling a wounded animal. One of them let out a soft snicker, raising her own glass to her painted lips. Victoria stepped closer, the cloying scent of her heavy floral perfume overwhelming the smell of roasted garlic drifting from the kitchen. "You are a high school graduate who spent her best years wiping down tables at a roadside diner. You have no degree, you have no pedigree, you have no business being in a room of this caliber. For years, you have used Leo as your personal meal ticket, riding his coattails while pretending your pathetic little sacrifices made you noble. But the free ride ends tonight. You are a toxic stain on my daughter's perfect wedding, and I wanted to make sure you understood exactly where you rank in our new family dynamic." She waited for the tears. I could see the hungry anticipation in her eyes. She wanted my lip to tremble. She wanted me to look down at my cheap shoes and run out the back door in a fit of hysterical weeping. Narcissists feed on the emotional wreckage they cause, drawing their power from the pain of their targets. But I had no tears to give her. As she stood there, mocking my lack of a college degree, my mind briefly flashed to the sleek, top-floor corporate office in downtown Salt Lake City where my framed business licenses hung. She called me a diner waitress, unaware that the woman standing before her controlled an international supply chain network. I had scrubbed those floors a lifetime ago to ensure Leo never went hungry, but I had not stayed on my knees. I had built an empire from the ground up, moving in the shadows, letting the world underestimate me while I amassed power. I kept my wealth a strict secret to protect Leo from the corrupting greed of people exactly like the Sterling family. I wanted him to love medicine for the sake of healing, not for the pursuit of luxury. "I am not here for your approval, Victoria," I replied, maintaining unbroken eye contact. Her smile faltered just a fraction as my calm demeanor denied her the dramatic reaction she sought. "I am here to support Leo," I continued. "The table you put me at does not change the fact that he is my brother." Before Victoria could launch another verbal assault, a thick, heavy scent of aged scotch and expensive cigar smoke signaled a new arrival. The sound of heavy leather dress shoes clicking against the marble floor echoed over the ambient noise. The crowd of smirking women parted immediately, stepping aside with deferential reverence. Richard Sterling emerged from the shadows. The real estate patriarch towered over the group, his broad shoulders filling out a custom Italian tuxedo. His silver hair was perfectly styled, and his face was set in a rigid, unforgiving scowl. He did not possess his wife's need for theatrical cruelty. He operated purely on control, leverage, and swift elimination of perceived problems. He stopped beside his wife, fixing his cold, calculating gaze directly on me. He looked at me not as a human being, but as a nuisance, a minor zoning violation standing in the way of his perfect property development. "Enough of this childish banter," Richard muttered, his deep voice scraping against the tension in the air. He did not bother to raise his voice. Men with true power rarely needed to shout. He turned his body slightly, reaching a thick, heavy hand inside the breast pocket of his tailored jacket. His eyes remained locked on mine as he withdrew a slim, leather-bound book. The gesture was slow, deliberate, and dripping with profound arrogance. He was a man accustomed to making problems vanish with the stroke of a pen. He believed every single person in the world had a price tag, and he had clearly calculated the exact market value of a poor, uneducated diner waitress. He opened the leather cover, his fingers resting on a crisp, watermarked slip of paper. He prepared to deliver what he firmly believed would be the final humiliating blow to my dignity. How much did the arrogant billionaire think my dignity was actually worth? Richard Sterling did not offer a polite greeting. He did not extend his hand or attempt to fake a welcoming smile for the sake of appearances. He operated with the blunt force of a man who viewed human beings as either appreciating assets or disposable liabilities. Right now, he clearly categorized me as the latter. His thick fingers gripped a slim leather checkbook. With a swift, practiced motion, he detached a pre-written corporate check. The sharp tear of perforated paper echoed in the quiet corner. He did not hand it to me. Instead, he tossed it onto the empty, cheap charger plate sitting on the wobbly table. The slip of paper fluttered for a brief second before landing face up, directly covering the cruel calligraphy card his wife had ordered. I looked down. The heavy textured paper bore the official watermark of Sterling Enterprises. In the center, written in sharp, bold ink, was the sum of $10,000. $10,000. A decade ago, that amount of money would have been a life-altering miracle. When Leo was still a teenager, navigating high school biology, $10,000 would have paid for a reliable heating system in our drafty apartment, covered his college application fees, and kept the electricity from being shut off during the bitter Utah winters. Back then, I would have scrubbed diner floors for 2 straight years to save a fraction of that sum. But looking at it now, resting on a bare table in a shadowy corner of a luxury resort, the check was nothing more than an insulting receipt for my dignity. "Listen to me very carefully," Alice Richard growled. His voice remained low, maintaining a volume designed to stay hidden from the wealthy guests mingling near the dance floor. You have played your part. You fed the boy. You clothed him. You managed to get him to the starting line. But your transactional role in his life is officially terminated. He leaned closer, the scent of aged scotch and expensive cigar smoke rolling off his tailored lapels. Julianne is a sterling. She is accustomed to a specific standard of living, surrounded by people of profound influence. Tonight, I have state politicians, hospital board members, and elite investors drinking champagne in the next room. I cannot have them wondering why the groom's sister looks like she just wandered in off the street begging for a handout. Your ghetto presence here is a glaring risk to my corporate image. Victoria stood beside him, her painted lips curving into a triumphant smirk. Her friends watched with eager, predatory eyes, waiting for my inevitable breakdown. They wanted a show. They wanted me to snatch the check, burst into pathetic tears, and run out the service exit. They expected me to tear the paper into dramatic, shredded pieces in a fit of lower-class rage. I did none of those things. I refused to grant them the satisfaction of a theatrical reaction. In the high-stakes world of corporate logistics, showing raw emotion was the fastest way to lose your leverage. I had spent years sitting across from ruthless supply chain executives negotiating billion-dollar contracts with a steady pulse and a cold stare. Richard Sterling was trying to bully a frightened waitress, entirely unaware he was attempting to intimidate the CEO of Apex Logistics. I reached out and picked up the check. The paper felt crisp between my fingers. I did not crumble it. I did not throw it back in his face. I calmly folded it perfectly in half, then in half again. I opened the clasp of my simple, unbranded purse and slipped the watermarked paper securely inside. I kept it not for the money, but for the profound tactical advantage it represented. It was a physical link to his private corporate accounts, a literal paper trail. Someday soon, I knew that piece of paper would become the exact weapon I needed. Richard watched me put the check away, his broad shoulders relaxing. A smug, victorious smile spread across his hardened features. He believed he had won. He believed he had successfully purchased my silence and my submission. "Smart girl," Richard murmured, adjusting his expensive silk tie. "Now turn around, walk out those kitchen doors, and do not ever contact my daughter or your brother again." Before I could deliver the sharp, calculated response forming on my tongue, the heavy wooden doors of the catering kitchen swung open with a sudden, forceful thrust. The harsh yellow light from the kitchen spilled across the dark carpet, accompanied by the chaotic clatter of silverware and the shouts of busy chefs. The heavy doors swung shut, cutting off the kitchen noise. Stepping into the shadowy corner were Leo and Julianne. My brother looked incredibly handsome in his sharp, tailored tuxedo. His dark hair was neatly styled, and his posture radiated the quiet confidence of a young man stepping into a bright future. Beside him, Julianne was a breathtaking vision. Her custom designer gown featured intricate lace detailing and a flowing silk train that trailed gracefully behind her. Her face held a radiant, blissful glow, her eyes shining with the pure joy of a bride on her wedding day. They had been searching the room for me, eager to share their happiness, but as they approached our isolated corner, the joyous atmosphere fractured. Julianne stopped walking. The bright, radiant smile vanished from her face, replaced by a look of profound confusion. Her eyes darted from the unlit bare table to her father's imposing frame, and then to her mother's tight, guilty smirk. She instantly recognized the predatory stance of her parents. She had grown up watching them use their wealth to intimidate business rivals, but she had never seen them aim that venom at her own wedding guests. Leo did not share her confusion. He possessed a sharp, analytical mind honed by years of rigorous medical training. He stepped forward, his dark eyes sweeping over the scene. He noticed my isolated position away from the other guests. He noticed the lack of a floral centerpiece. He noticed the tense, breathless silence hanging in the air. Then his gaze dropped to the table. Sitting on the plain charger plate was the crisp, white seating card. Victoria had been so eager to watch Richard hand me the bribe that she had forgotten to remove the initial insult. The elegant charcoal calligraphy caught the dim light. Poor, uneducated sister living off her brother. I watched Leo read the words. A visible tremor ran through his broad shoulders. The warm, joyous groom vanished, instantly replaced by the fierce, fiercely protective young man who had watched me sacrifice everything for him. He remembered the nights I skipped dinner so he could eat. He remembered the icy winter mornings I walked miles to the bus stop so he could take the only working car to his university classes. He knew the exact heavy cost of his medical degree, and he knew I had paid it in full with my own sweat and exhaustion. The realization of his new family's pure, unadulterated evil washed over his face. The rigid masks of high society etiquette shattered. He did not need to ask Richard what was happening. He did not ask his new mother-in-law for a polite explanation. Leo dropped Julianne's hand. He stepped forward, placing his body directly between me and Richard Sterling. He stood tall, squaring his shoulders against the billionaire real estate tycoon. The silence in the dark corner grew deafening, heavy with impending consequence. When Leo spoke, his voice was not loud, but it vibrated with a dark, protective fury that sent a chill through the air. He set the stage for a public execution, refusing to let the wealthy elite crush the sister who had built his foundation. How will the bride react when she discovers her family's true toxic nature? Leo reached back and gripped my hand. His fingers were warm, steady, and unyielding. The trembling in his shoulders ceased, replaced by a rigid, stony stillness. He turned his dark, burning gaze directly onto Richard Sterling. The billionaire patriarch, accustomed to intimidating young executives and pliant politicians, seemed briefly unsettled by the sheer intensity radiating from the groom. "You just made the costliest mistake of your life," Leo announced. His voice was low, carrying a lethal clarity that sliced through the ambient hum of the distant string quartet and the clatter of the nearby kitchen. Richard's face tightened. The smug, victorious smile he had worn mere moments ago evaporated, replaced by the hardened glare of a man whose authority had just been challenged. He straightened his tailored posture, attempting to reclaim his dominance. "Watch your tone, boy," Richard warned, his voice a gravelly threat. "Do not forget who is funding this elaborate circus. I paid for the orchids. I paid for the open bar. I am paying for your future clinic. You will not disrespect me in front of my wife and her guests." Leo did not flinch. He did not retreat. He tightened his grip on my hand, standing as a physical barrier against the suffocating arrogance of the Sterling family. "You bought a party," Richard Leo replied, his tone devoid of fear. "You did not buy me. And you certainly did not buy the right to treat the woman who raised me like garbage." Behind Richard, Victoria let out a sharp, indignant scoff. She raised her chin, her conflict-free diamonds catching the dim light. "Oh, please, Leo, do not be so theatrical. It was a simple seating arrangement. Your sister is entirely out of her element here. We were merely protecting our guests from an uncomfortable social interaction." Leo ignored her entirely. His attention remained fixed on Richard, the true architect of the insult. While the tension thickened in the dark corner, Julianne remained frozen a few feet away. The radiant, blissful bride had transformed into a pale, horrified statue. Her eyes were locked on the plain charger plate, reading the elegant charcoal calligraphy over and over again. Poor, uneducated sister living off her brother. The words seemed to physically strike her, shattering the pristine, gilded illusion of her family's prestige. Julianne had grown up in the velvet-lined bubble of Park City's elite. She had spent her entire life attending exclusive preparatory schools, riding imported equestrian horses, and vacationing in the Swiss Alps. But beneath the heavy layers of inherited wealth, Julianne possessed a genuine, compassionate heart. She loved Leo deeply. She knew the stories of his childhood. She knew about the cold winter nights I had wrapped him in my only coat. She knew I had worked a double shift at the diner on the day of my own high school graduation just to pay his middle school tuition. She looked from the cruel seating card to her mother's unapologetic smirk, and finally to her father's imposing, rigid stance. The horrifying truth of her parents' nature crashed down upon her. They were not just protective or traditional. They were vicious. Julianne took a halting step forward, her breath hitching in her throat. "Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of disbelief and rising anger. "What did you do?" Richard turned his massive frame toward his daughter. His expression softened slightly, adopting the patronizing tone he often used to dismiss her concerns. "Julianne, sweetheart, this does not concern you," Richard said smoothly, reaching out a thick hand to guide her away. "Your mother and I are simply handling a minor logistical issue. Turn around and go back to the dance floor. The photographers are waiting for the cake cutting. We will join you in a moment." He reached for her arm, fully expecting her to obey the command as she had done her entire life. He expected her to turn a blind eye to the cruelty, to prioritize the polished surface of the social event over the ugly reality hidden in the shadows. Instead of stepping back into the warm light of the ballroom, Julianne planted her feet firmly on the carpet. As Richard's fingers closed around her forearm, she jerked away with a sudden, fierce motion. The unexpected resistance caught Richard off guard. He stumbled a half-step forward, his eyes widening in genuine surprise. "Do not touch me," Julianne said, her voice rising above a whisper, echoing clearly in the secluded corner. Victoria gasped, pressing a manicured hand against her chest. "Julianne Sterling, do not you dare speak to your father that way. You are making a scene." "I do not care about the scene," Julianne shouted, her voice finally breaking free from years of stifled obedience. "I care about what you did to Alice. I care that you used my wedding as an excuse to humiliate the only reason my husband is standing here today." Richard's face darkened, a dangerous red flush creeping up his neck. He was losing control of the narrative, and men like Richard Sterling despised losing control. He took a threatening step toward his daughter. "You are acting hysterical, Julianne. You are letting a cheap, lower-class maid ruin the most important night of your life. Now I am telling you, for the last time, turn around and walk away from this trash." The word hung in the air, a final, toxic confirmation of his true character. Julianne stared at the man who had raised her, the man who had bought her ponies and paid her tuition, but who had never taught her a single lesson about empathy or grace. She looked down at her breathtaking custom designer wedding gown. The dress was a masterpiece of haute couture, featuring layers of delicate imported silk, intricate French lace, and a heavy cascading tulle train. It had cost $30,000, paid in full by Richard's corporate accounts. It was a physical manifestation of his wealth, a heavy gilded cage designed to bind her to his legacy. Julianne reached down with both hands. She grabbed the delicate silk tulle near her waistline, her fingers curled tightly into the expensive, restrictive fabric. "I would rather be homeless than wear anything your money bought," Julianne declared, her voice ringing with a fierce, newfound independence. With a sharp, violent pull, Julianne ripped the fabric. The shocking sound of tearing silk tore through the air, louder than the clattering dishes, louder than the distant string quartet. The heavy cascading train detached, falling uselessly to the floor. The intricate lace shredded, freeing her legs from the restrictive weight of the gown. She was shedding the toxic, heavy ownership of her family's wealth, physically stripping away their control. She kicked off her uncomfortable designer heels, leaving them discarded next to the ruined train. She stood in the tattered remains of the dress, her bare feet planted firmly on the carpet, radiating a profound, beautiful defiance. Victoria let out a horrified, theatrical shriek, burying her face in her hands as the pristine image of her perfect daughter shattered into jagged pieces. Richard stood paralyzed, his jaw slack, entirely incapable of processing the monumental rebellion unfolding before his eyes. Julianne stepped past her stunned parents. She walked directly to Leo, weaving her fingers tightly through his free hand. She did not look back. Leo squeezed my hand, offering a sharp, determined nod. We did not need to speak. The three of us turned our backs on the dark, isolated corner and began to walk. We did not sneak out the service exit. We did not slip quietly through the shadows to avoid detection. We marched confidently, shoulder to shoulder, directly out of the darkness and straight into the blazing light of the grand ballroom. Our sudden appearance halted the reception entirely. The string quartet stopped playing mid-note, their bows hovering awkwardly over the strings. Conversations died in the throats of the elite guests. Hundreds of eyes turned toward the center of the room, wide with shock and morbid curiosity. They saw the groom, his jaw set in stone. They saw the sister in the cheap navy dress walking with her head held high. And they saw the bride, barefoot, wearing a violently shredded, ruined designer gown, holding tightly to her new family. We walked through the parted crowd, navigating the sea of silent, staring faces. We left Richard and Victoria standing in the shadowy corner, isolated in the ruins of their highly expensive social event, humiliated in front of every prominent politician and investor in the state of Utah. We pushed through the heavy glass doors of the resort, stepping out into the cool, crisp mountain air. The heavy, suffocating weight of the Sterling family's toxic privilege vanished, replaced by the deep, profound peace of genuine loyalty. We had won the battle in the ballroom. We had claimed our dignity and walked away. But men like Richard Sterling do not retreat when their massive egos are publicly bruised. They dig in. They calculate. They use every ounce of their leverage to crush the opposition. We had struck a massive blow to his public image, and I knew the retaliation would be swift, ruthless, and designed to leave us in absolute ruin. But how violently will a disgraced billionaire retaliate the morning after his public destruction? The crisp Sunday morning sun filtered through the cheap plastic blinds of my modest Salt Lake City apartment, casting long, thin shadows across the worn linoleum floor. The air inside was quiet, carrying the simple, grounding scent of freshly brewed dark roast coffee. It was a stark departure from the suffocating luxury of the resort we had left behind hours earlier. Here, there were no crystal chandeliers, no hovering waitstaff, and no hidden agendas. There was only the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the safety of four walls that I had paid for with my own honest labor. Julianne sat at my chipped Formica kitchen table. The breathtaking restrictive designer gown from yesterday was gone, replaced by one of my oversized faded college hoodies. The soft, worn cotton swallowed her petite frame. Her face was scrubbed clean of the heavy professional makeup, revealing the faint dusting of freckles across her nose. For the first time since I met her, she did not look like a curated asset of the Sterling family empire. She looked like a normal 24-year-old woman. She wrapped her hands around a warm ceramic mug, her bare feet tucked underneath her on the chair. The faded hoodie was more than just borrowed clothing. It was a physical sanctuary, a soft armor representing the authentic, unconditional freedom she had chosen over her gilded cage. Leo sat beside her, wearing a plain white t-shirt and dark jeans. The dark circles under his eyes spoke of a sleepless night, but his posture remained steadfast. He reached across the small table, resting his hand over hers. Julianne leaned into his touch, a faint, fragile smile touching her lips. I leaned against the kitchen counter, watching them in the quiet morning light. For 15 years, my primary function had been to shield Leo from the harsh, unforgiving realities of the world. I had absorbed the stress of unpaid bills, the exhaustion of double shifts, and the biting cold of Utah winters, so he could focus entirely on textbooks and medical exams. I had built a fortress around his potential. Watching him sit there offering that same protective warmth to Julianne told me every single sacrifice had been worth the price. That brief, reflective peace was suddenly shattered. 3 sharp, heavy pounds struck my front door. The sound was not the polite knock of a neighbor borrowing sugar or the rhythmic tap of a mail carrier. It was a demanding, authoritative strike that rattled the cheap wooden frame on its hinges. Julianne flinched, her coffee sloshing over the rim of the mug. Leo stood up immediately, his protective instincts overriding his exhaustion. I held up a hand, signaling him to stay put. I set my own mug on the counter and walked down the short, narrow hallway. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Standing on my welcome mat was a tall, imposing man in a slate gray suit. He wore a Bluetooth earpiece and held a thick, sealed manila envelope. He did not smile. He did not offer a polite Sunday morning greeting. He operated with the cold, detached efficiency of a corporate mercenary. Alice Rivera and Leo Rivera, the man stated, his tone flat and unyielding. Before I could confirm or deny, he thrust the heavy envelope directly into my chest, forcing me to take it. He turned on his heel and strode rapidly down the apartment hallway, disappearing into the stairwell without another word. I closed the door, sliding the deadbolt back into place. The envelope felt unnaturally heavy in my hands. The return address, printed in the top left corner, belonged to a prestigious, notoriously ruthless corporate law firm headquartered in downtown Salt Lake City. I carried the package back into the kitchen, setting it down on the center of the table. Leo reached out and tore the thick paper open. He pulled out a stack of crisp, heavily watermarked legal documents. Because it was Sunday, the federal courthouses and state clerks were closed. This was not a filed lawsuit bearing a judge's signature. It was a highly predatory cease and desist and notice of intent to sue, drafted specifically to incite sheer terror before the work week even began. Leo read the front page, the color draining rapidly from his face. "He is coming after us," Leo murmured, his voice tight. I leaned over his shoulder, my eyes scanning the dense, threatening legalese. Richard Sterling had authorized his attack dogs to demand $250,000 in immediate damages. The document cited a litany of fabricated grievances, including breach of verbal contract, tortious interference with a highly publicized social event, and the intentional infliction of severe emotional distress. The injunction accompanying the threat demanded an immediate, total freeze on all of Leo's personal bank accounts to secure the projected damages. It was a classic intimidation tactic. Richard knew a young medical resident and a former diner waitress did not possess $250,000 in liquid cash. He was attempting to bury us under an insurmountable mountain of fake corporate debt, banking on the assumption that the sheer terror of bankruptcy would force us to surrender. As the gravity of the legal threat settled over the kitchen table, the silence was broken again. Leo's cell phone, resting next to his coffee mug, began to vibrate. He stared at the glowing screen. The caller ID displayed the name of Dr. Aris, the chief director of the pediatric residency program at the regional hospital. It was a man Leo admired deeply, a mentor who had championed Leo's proposal to open a free pediatric clinic in an underserved Salt Lake neighborhood. Leo swallowed hard and tapped the speaker icon, answering the call. Dr. Aris, Leo said, trying to keep his voice level. "It is Sunday. Is everything all right at the hospital?" Leo, the older man, began, his voice strained and noticeably uncomfortable. "I am sorry to call you so early on your weekend. I wish this conversation could wait until Monday, but the board requested I reach out to you immediately." Julianne tightened her grip on Leo's hand, sensing the impending devastation. "What is going on, sir?" Leo asked. Dr. Aris cleared his throat. "I received a phone call this morning from the hospital administrators. They were out on the golf course with a major philanthropic donor, Richard Sterling." The name hung in the air like a drop of poison. "Richard is a primary benefactor for the new pediatric wing," Dr. Aris continued, the regret heavy in his tone. "He expressed profound concerns regarding your upcoming free clinic initiative. He suggested that funding a project led by someone with unpredictable family dynamics might be a liability to the hospital's reputation." Leo closed his eyes. The clinic was his dream. It was the culmination of thousands of hours of study, clinical rotations, and passionate advocacy. He had secured the initial $2 million grant just 3 weeks ago. "Are they pulling the funding?" Leo asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "The grant is officially frozen," Dr. Aris replied. "The board has placed the entire project on hold, pending a moral character review of the primary applicant." "I fought for you, Leo, but Sterling carries too much influence. I am so sorry. My hands are tied." The line clicked and went dead. The dial tone hummed softly before Leo ended the call, leaving the kitchen in total, suffocating silence. Richard Sterling had executed a masterclass in swift, ruthless, corporate retaliation. In less than 12 hours, he had drafted a crippling financial lawsuit to starve us out and leveraged his elite country club connections to destroy Leo's professional medical career. He believed that cutting off our oxygen, trapping us in a corner with no money and no future, would break our spirit. He was betting everything on the assumption that the overwhelming pressure would force Julianne to abandon her newfound freedom and crawl back to the Sterling estate, begging her father for mercy. Julianne broke. The stoic bravery she had displayed in the ballroom cracked under the weight of her father's cruelty. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with terrified, ragged sobs. "It is my fault," she cried, tears spilling through her fingers and spotting the faded fabric of the college hoodie. "I ruined your life, Leo. He is going to take everything from you because of me. I should have just kept my mouth shut." Leo pulled her into his arms, pressing his face against her hair. "Do not say that," he whispered fiercely. "I do not care about the money. I do not care about the grant. I only care about you. We will find another way." I stood watching them, my mind rapidly processing the incoming data. I did not feel the panic Richard intended to provoke. Instead, my pulse slowed, settling into a cold, calculated rhythm. Richard Sterling had played his opening hand. He had revealed his tactics. He fought with paper leverage and intimidation. He fought like a man who had never faced an opponent capable of hitting back. He was orchestrating the physical destruction of our livelihood. But Richard was only half of the Sterling equation. While the patriarch handled the financial strangulation, his wife operated in a completely different arena. The legal threats were only the physical attack. What psychological warfare was Victoria unleashing online? The devastating silence following the phone call with Dr. Aris was short-lived. A sharp, rapid succession of electronic chimes pierced the air. Julianne's smartphone, resting face up near the legal documents, began to vibrate intensely, sliding a few inches across the Formica table. The screen lit up, flooded with an endless stream of frantic notifications. Text messages, direct messages, and social media alerts stacked on top of one another faster than the eye could track. Julianne pulled away from Leo's embrace, wiping her tear-stained cheeks with the frayed sleeve of the hoodie. She reached out and grabbed the device. As her thumb swiped across the screen, her eyes widened. The terror from moments ago morphed into sheer disbelief. "What is it?" Leo asked, leaning closer to look over her shoulder. Julianne could not find the words. She simply tapped the screen and slid the phone to the center of the table, turning the volume up. The bright display filled with the live broadcast of an Instagram feed. The viewer count in the top corner was rapidly climbing, already past 5,000, and accelerating by the second. The familiar, cloying voice of Victoria Sterling drifted from the tiny speakers, filling my kitchen with toxic, manufactured grief. Victoria sat in the center of her sprawling sunroom at the Sterling estate in Park City. Morning light poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, highlighting the perfect arrangement of imported orchids behind her. She had discarded the emerald designer gown from the night before, opting instead for a conservative pearl-white cashmere sweater. It was an outfit carefully chosen to project innocence, vulnerability, and maternal heartbreak. She held a monogrammed silk handkerchief, dabbing expertly at dry eyes. "My dear friends," Victoria began, her voice quivering with practiced theatrical sorrow. "I am coming to you today with a profoundly heavy heart. I need to ask for your prayers and your support. Last night was supposed to be the most joyous occasion of my life. My beautiful daughter Julianne was marrying the man she loved. We welcomed Leo into our home with open arms, ready to embrace him as our own son." She paused, taking a shaky, dramatic breath, ensuring the camera captured every nuance of her performance. But we gravely underestimated the dark, manipulative influence of his older sister, Alice Rivera. My name hung in the digital space, a target painted on my back for thousands of her high society followers to see. Victoria leaned closer to the lens, her expression shifting from sorrow to righteous indignation. "Alice is a deeply troubled, bitter woman. She has spent her entire life harboring intense jealousy toward anyone who has achieved success. She could not bear the thought of her brother marrying into a respectable family. She could not stand to lose her control over him. So she maliciously brainwashed my naive, innocent daughter. I watched the screen, maintaining my calm exterior while observing the sheer audacity of her public lies. Victoria was not just defending her bruised ego. She was executing a calculated digital assassination. During the reception, Alice orchestrated a cruel public spectacle. Victoria continued pointing an accusing finger at the camera. She intentionally disrupted the wedding, causing a massive scene, all as part of a wicked extortion plot to steal our family's wealth. She manipulated Julianne into tearing her beautiful wedding gown and forced her to walk out into the cold night. The comments section scrolling rapidly up the side of the screen was a bloodbath of elite privilege. Names I recognized from the St. Regis guest list, prominent Utah community leaders, and wealthy country club members chimed in with furious agreement. They typed out paragraphs of vitriol, demanding justice for the Sterling family. Deacons from their exclusive church posted praying hands emojis. Wives of hospital board members called me a ghetto opportunist, a dangerous predator, and a manipulative criminal. This was not just gossip. It was a targeted campaign designed to permanently destroy Julianne's social standing and Leo's professional reputation. Victoria was actively weaponizing the court of public opinion. By painting me as a criminal mastermind and Leo as my complicit partner, she was ensuring that no respectable medical practice or hospital in the entire state of Utah would ever hire him. She was validating Richard's decision to freeze the clinic grant, making it appear as a necessary precaution against fraudulent predators. "They are ruining you," Julianne whispered, her voice cracking. "My mother is making sure no one in this city will ever speak to us again." Leo watched the screen, his jaw set, anger tightening the muscles in his neck. "Let them talk," he said. "We know the truth." But the truth rarely mattered when a billionaire held the microphone. I continued to watch the broadcast. Victoria dabbed at her eyes one final time. "I tried to warn Julianne," she said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "We tried to warn the hospital board about the Rivera family's toxic dynamics, but our warnings were ignored. However, you do not need to take my word for it." Victoria shifted her position on the plush velvet sofa. The camera panned slowly to the right, revealing the empty seat beside her. "Someone else has bravely decided to step forward and speak the truth about Alice Rivera's true character," Victoria announced. The camera stopped moving. Sitting comfortably next to Victoria was a woman wearing an obnoxious, bright yellow designer dress. Her hair was heavily styled, and her face bore a deeply smug, self-satisfied smirk. The breath caught in my throat. A cold, sharp spike of genuine shock pierced my chest. I had spent the last 15 years maintaining a strict, impenetrable wall around my private life, keeping the vultures of my past far away from Leo's bright future. I had assumed Victoria's elite circles were too snobbish to dig into the murky waters of my background. I had severely underestimated the lengths a disgraced socialite would go to secure a weapon. Victoria's private investigators had worked swiftly through the night. They had dug through old public records, outdated addresses, and forgotten family ties to unearth a ghost I thought I had buried a decade ago. Who did Victoria's private investigators dig up overnight to plunge the ultimate knife into my back? Sitting right next to Victoria, adjusting the neckline of a highly obnoxious bright yellow designer dress, was my very own Aunt Clara. The garment clashed terribly with the muted, sophisticated elegance of the sunroom. It revealed a desperate woman, eager to belong to a world that would only ever view her as a disposable tool. A sharp, metallic taste flooded my mouth. Blood betrayal carries a distinct, unforgiving flavor, hitting deeper than any insult a stranger could ever hurl. Clara leaned toward the camera lens, her eyes gleaming with a practiced, sorrowful expression. She placed a comforting, manicured hand over Victoria's wrist. "It breaks my heart to speak against my own flesh and blood," Clara murmured, her voice dripping with fabricated grief. "But Victoria is telling the truth. I tried to step in and raise Alice and Leo after my sister passed away in that terrible car crash. I opened my home to them. I offered to pay for their schooling. But Alice was always a dark, calculating girl. She rejected my charity. She isolated her brother, using him to scheme her way into better circles. She is a parasite, plain and simple. Leo let out a ragged breath, his hands balling into tight fists on the kitchen table. Julianne stared at the glowing screen, her brow furrowed in pure disgust. They knew the reality. They knew Clara had never offered a warm home or a single dime of charity. Clara's cloying voice faded into the background, drowned out by a sudden rushing sound in my ears. The sunlit kitchen around me dissolved, replaced by the phantom chill of freezing rain lashing against icy pavement. 15 years vanished in a heartbeat. I was 19 years old again. The biting Utah winter wind cut straight through my thin thrift store jacket. I stood shivering in the sterile, polished lobby of a downtown financial institution, gripping 11-year-old Leo's hand to keep his small frame from trembling. We smelled of wet wool and desperation, standing on a pristine marble floor that belonged to people who never had to worry about their next meal. An indifferent bank manager wearing a crisp, expensive suit sat across a wide mahogany desk. He pushed a thin file folder toward me, offering a polite, hollow apology that did not reach his eyes. The records were undeniable. Clara had swooped in mere days after our parents' fatal accident. While I was occupied trying to organize a modest funeral and keep Child Protective Services away from Leo, Clara had forged my signature on the primary beneficiary release forms. The $100,000 life insurance policy was gone. It was the singular financial safety net our parents had worked their entire lives to build, meant to protect us from ruin. It had been legally transferred into Clara's private accounts. While Leo and I faced immediate eviction notices, Clara purchased a sprawling suburban house with pristine landscaping. I pleaded with the bank manager. I showed him my true signature. I begged him to freeze the account. He simply clicked his expensive pen, adjusted his glasses, and stated that the matter was a civil dispute outside the bank's jurisdiction. He called security. A uniformed guard placed a heavy hand on my shoulder and escorted us out. The heavy glass doors locked behind us with a definitive, exclusionary click. I stood on the wet sidewalk, wrapping my arms around Leo to shield him from the downpour. I tilted my head back, staring up at the towering glass and steel monolith of the bank. The freezing rain mixed with hot tears on my cheeks. That day, shivering in the storm, I made a silent, unshakable vow. I would not just survive the poverty forced upon us. I would one day own the very institutions that discarded us. I spent the next 5 years fulfilling the grueling reality of that promise. I scrubbed diner floors until my knuckles bled and my skin smelled permanently of industrial bleach and stale coffee. I worked consecutive graveyard shifts beneath buzzing neon signs to keep the electricity on and ensure Leo never missed a meal. I learned the brutal, unforgiving mathematics of being poor in a rich city. Then, a minor workplace negligence dispute provided a meager settlement payout. It was barely enough to cover 3 months of rent. Instead of paying advance bills, I took a calculated, terrifying risk. I purchased a rusted, second-hand freight truck. I taught myself supply chain logistics in the dim light of our cramped apartment, studying route maps on a cracked laptop. I secured 1 local delivery contract, then 3, then 10. Over the next decade, that single rusted truck evolved into Apex Logistics. I navigated cutthroat boardrooms, absorbed failing competitors, and scaled a national distribution network. I built a multi-billion-dollar private equity and supply chain conglomerate. I commanded fleets, warehouses, and commercial real estate portfolios across the country. I became the anonymous, untouchable CEO operating entirely in the shadows. Despite my staggering net worth, I refused to upgrade our lifestyle. I stayed in the chipped apartment. I drove a 10-year-old sedan. I maintained the facade of a struggling waitress who had transitioned into a modest office manager. I did this purposefully. I had watched wealth rot the souls of people like Clara, breeding entitlement and cruelty. I needed Leo to stay fiercely grounded. I wanted him to pursue medicine, driven by a genuine hunger to heal people, shielded from the corrupting influence of a trust fund. My deception worked flawlessly. He grew into a brilliant, compassionate man. The Instagram Live broadcast ended, the screen fading to black and plunging my kitchen back into heavy silence. Julianne looked at me, her eyes brimming with fresh tears, terrified by the sheer scope of her mother's digital destruction. Leo stared at the manila envelope containing the predatory lawsuit. The hospital grant was frozen. The Sterling family believed they were crushing a defenseless insect. They thought their money made them invincible gods, commanding the fate of a lowly waitress. They were entirely unaware that they had just declared war on a Leviathan. I had the power to eradicate Richard Sterling's entire legacy with a single phone call to my acquisitions team. But striking blindly would only create chaos. I needed to unspool his trap, methodically letting him believe he was winning before I pulled the floor out from under him. With my secret empire intact, how could I strategically disarm Richard without blowing my cover too early? I pushed myself away from the kitchen counter. The heavy legal envelope sat on the table like an unexploded bomb. Leo stared at it, the knuckles on his hands turning white as he gripped the edge of the Formica table. Julianne wiped her eyes, struggling to process the devastating speed of her parents' coordinated attack. "Give me the lawsuit," I requested, keeping my tone perfectly measured. Leo looked up, his brow furrowing. "What are you going to do, Alice? We do not have money for a defense attorney. If we do not respond to this injunction, they can petition a judge to freeze my residency placement." I extended my hand. "Hand it to me, Leo. I have handled worse problems." He hesitated, the protective instinct warring with his exhaustion, before finally sliding the thick packet toward me. I took the documents and walked toward the small coat rack near the front door. I pulled on my worn olive green canvas jacket and grabbed my car keys. "Stay here," I instructed, "both of you. Do not post anything on social media. Do not answer unknown phone numbers. Do not engage with Clara or Victoria. I need to make a few stops." Julianne stood up the oversized hoodie, swallowing her frame. "Where are you going?" she asked, her voice trembling. "My father will have people watching you. He uses private security contractors. They follow his targets to build intimidation files." I paused with my hand on the doorknob. "Let them watch," I replied softly. I stepped out into the crisp Sunday morning air and slid behind the wheel of my unremarkable 10-year-old sedan. To the casual observer, the car was a relic of struggling lower-middle-class existence. The paint was faded, and a small dent marred the rear bumper. No one outside my inner circle knew the engine block housed a custom-built, military-grade, encrypted tracking jammer, ensuring that anyone attempting to follow my digital footprint would find nothing but dead ends. But today, I did not want to hide. I needed Richard's hounds to see exactly where I was going. I drove slowly across town, navigating away from the polished downtown business district and heading toward a dilapidated strip mall on the outskirts of Salt Lake City. The area featured cracked pavement, overflowing dumpsters, and a series of rundown storefronts. I parked directly under the flickering neon sign of a predatory payday loan center. The glass windows were plastered with garish red letters, promising fast cash and immediate lawsuit funding. I sat in the car for 3 minutes. I checked my rearview mirror. A dark, unmarked SUV idled near the edge of the parking lot, its tinted windows offering a clear line of sight to my vehicle. Julianne had been right. Richard's private investigators were already tailing me. Perfect. I stepped out of the sedan, making sure to slump my shoulders. I adopted the physical posture of a woman suffocating under the weight of an impending financial collapse. I dragged my feet across the cracked asphalt, clutching the thick legal envelope tightly against my chest, and pushed through the heavy glass doors of the loan center. The interior smelled of cheap air freshener and stale desperation. A bored clerk sat behind a thick pane of bulletproof acrylic. I walked up to the counter and slid my civilian driver's license through the small metal slot. "I need to apply for a $50,000 personal loan," I told the clerk, injecting a calculated tremor into my voice. "I need the cash immediately to secure a legal retainer. I can offer my vehicle and my apartment lease as collateral." The clerk glanced at my worn canvas jacket, typed a few keystrokes into a dusty terminal, and pushed a towering stack of high-interest application forms through the slot. I spent the next 20 minutes filling out the paperwork by hand, ensuring my civilian name and the details of Richard's crippling lawsuit were highly visible. I knew the loan application would never clear. A waitress salary profile attempting to secure $50,000 against a rusted sedan would generate an instant automated denial. The rejection was irrelevant. The entire performance was a carefully staged illusion. It was a red herring. By the time I walked back out to my car, clutching the rejection slip and looking thoroughly defeated, the dark SUV in the corner of the lot briefly flashed its brake lights. The investigator had his confirmation. I drove back to my apartment imagining the scene unfolding 20 miles away in Park City. Within the hour, the investigator's encrypted report hit Richard Sterling's private phone. I could visualize Richard and Victoria sitting in their sun-drenched estate, reviewing the surveillance photos. They saw the faded car, the rundown strip mall, and the predatory loan center. They saw a poor, uneducated sister desperately scrambling to secure high-interest cash to fend off a massive corporate lawsuit. They believed they had drawn blood. They believed their synchronized attack, the lawsuit, the frozen grant, the digital smear campaign had successfully pushed me to the absolute brink of total bankruptcy. Richard probably unbuttoned his tailored vest, leaned back in his leather chair, and ordered a servant to bring up a bottle of expensive champagne. Victoria likely clinked her crystal flute against his, celebrating their swift, toxic victory over the lower-class maid who had dared to disrupt their perfect social event. They dropped their guard entirely. They stopped looking for a hidden threat because they were thoroughly convinced the target was already drowning. While they laughed and toasted to my fabricated demise, I parked my sedan, walked up the stairs to my apartment, and securely locked the deadbolt. Leo and Julianne were sitting quietly in the living room, watching the muted television. I offered them a reassuring nod, walked straight into my small bedroom, and closed the door. I sat down at my modest desk. I reached under the drawer panel, pressing my thumb against a biometric scanner hidden from view. A soft click echoed in the quiet room. A secret compartment slid open, revealing a high-powered, encrypted corporate laptop. I booted the system, the glowing screen illuminating the dark room. A complex array of secure networks, offshore banking portals, and supply chain analytics flared to life. I was no longer the struggling waitress begging for a payday loan. I was the anonymous CEO of Apex Logistics, and I was preparing to unleash the full, terrifying power of a multi-billion-dollar empire. Richard Sterling's real estate developments relied heavily on commercial bridge loans and leveraged corporate debt. He was a master of using other people's money to build his luxury high-rises. To dismantle him, I could not just attack his public image. I had to sever his financial arteries. I had to buy the debt holding his empire together and pull the floor out from under him. But my elite acquisitions team needed specific data. Richard was notorious for hiding his true liabilities behind complex webs of shell companies and anonymous limited liability corporations. Without knowing the exact corporate structures holding his toxic debt buying him out would take months of forensic accounting. I needed the transaction ledgers. I needed the hidden account numbers. To completely obliterate Richard's real estate empire, I needed hard evidence. Who would provide the ultimate key? The soft hum of my encrypted laptop filled the small bedroom. Lines of complex financial code reflected against my face in the dim light. I accessed the secure server connecting directly to Marcus, my chief financial officer at Apex Logistics. I typed out a swift coded command instructing his team to begin a deep dive analysis into the public records of Sterling Enterprises. I needed them to find the fragile fault lines in Richard's commercial real estate portfolio. A quiet, tentative knock sounded at my bedroom door. "Come in," I said, minimizing the active communication windows on my screen. The door opened slowly. Julianne stepped inside, pulling the door shut behind her until the latch clicked securely into place. She still wore my faded college hoodie, but her posture had changed. The terrified, trembling girl who had wept at the kitchen table over the frozen hospital grant was gone. She stood taller, her jaw set with a fierce, quiet determination. The devastation of her mother's digital smear campaign and her father's legal threats had burned away the last remnants of her obedience. "Leo is pacing a hole in your living room rug," she said softly, offering a faint, weary smile. "He is trying to figure out how to sell his car to pay a defense attorney." "He does not need to sell his car," I replied, maintaining my calm demeanor. "I am handling the legal injunction." Julianne walked closer, her eyes dropping to the glowing screen of my high-powered laptop. The piece of hardware was entirely incongruous with the tipped furniture and threadbare rug of my apartment. It was a machine designed for heavy corporate espionage, not managing diner shift schedules. She studied the sleek, unmarked chassis for a moment before looking back up at my face. "You are not a waitress, Alice," Julianne stated. It was not a question. It was a sudden, clear realization. I leaned back in my chair, holding her gaze. "No, I am not." She did not ask for a lengthy explanation. She did not demand to know my net worth or the exact nature of my business. The betrayal of her family had sharpened her instincts, and she understood that the secrets I kept were designed to protect Leo, a stark contrast to the secrets her parents kept, which were designed to destroy people. Julianne reached her right hand deep into the front pocket of the oversized hoodie. Her fingers curled around a small, metallic object. She pulled her hand free and extended her palm toward me. Resting in the center of her hand was a sleek, silver flash drive. It lacked any brand markings, its casing smooth and heavy. 3 weeks before the wedding, I was looking for a digital copy of the catering contracts on my father's home office computer. Julianne explained, her voice steady, but carrying the weight of a dark confession. He had left his primary terminal unlocked. I opened what I thought was the event planning folder. It was a mislabeled directory. She stepped closer, placing the cold metal drive directly onto my desk, inches away from my keyboard. "I found his private accounting ledgers," she continued. "I do not have a finance degree, Alice, but I know how to read a balance sheet. The numbers did not make sense. He was claiming massive profits on luxury developments in Park City, but the internal routing numbers showed he was pulling capital from unfinished projects to pay the interest on massive commercial bridge loans. He is robbing Peter to pay Paul." A sharp thrill of adrenaline spiked in my chest. A Ponzi scheme. Richard Sterling was projecting the image of a billionaire tycoon, securing prestige and political leverage while actively running a high-stakes financial fraud to keep his empire from collapsing under the weight of its own debt. I downloaded the core directory onto that drive. Julianne whispered, wrapping her arms around her torso as if the memory itself chilled her. I was terrified. You know how he operates. He destroys anyone who threatens his image. I convinced myself I was misunderstanding the data. I told myself to stay quiet, to just focus on marrying Leo and getting away from them. She looked down at the drive, a fierce fire igniting in her eyes. "But then I saw what he did to you at the reception. I saw what my mother did online today. They are monsters. And this drive is a bomb." I picked up the silver flash drive. It felt incredibly heavy, pregnant with the potential to eradicate a dynasty. Julianne had risked her own safety to secure the very ammunition I needed. Her loyalty to Leo and her newly forged loyalty to me had provided the ultimate weapon. "Thank you, Julianne," I said quietly. "You just leveled the playing field." I plugged the drive into the secure port on my laptop. A decryption prompt immediately flared on the screen. Julianne provided the complex alphanumeric password she had used to lock the files. The progress bar loaded, and within seconds, a massive directory of spreadsheets, bank routing protocols, and internal corporate memos populated my monitor. I opened the primary ledger. The data was incredibly damning. Julianne's suspicions were entirely correct. Richard's real estate empire was a fragile house of cards. The ledgers detailed exactly $40 million in heavily defaulted commercial bridge loans. He had leveraged his existing properties to secure high-risk capital, funneling the money to project an illusion of extreme wealth. But as I dug deeper into the raw data, my initial thrill cooled into a hardened strategic focus. Richard Sterling was arrogant, but he was not stupid. He knew the federal authorities would eventually scrutinize his public filings. To hide the ultimate proof of his federal tax evasion and shield his remaining liquid capital from potential bankruptcy seizure, he had expertly buried his illicit funds. The spreadsheets indicated that millions of dollars were being systematically diverted out of Sterling Enterprises before the defaulted loans came due. However, the destination fields on the ledgers were blank. Richard had routed the stolen capital through a complex web of anonymous, numbered, offshore shell companies. The money vanished into the digital ether. There were no bank names. There were no geographic identifiers. There were only fragmented numerical codes that stopped abruptly, leading nowhere. I leaned closer to the screen, my eyes scanning the jagged columns of incomplete data. The flash drive Julianne provided was a monumental breakthrough. It gave us the lock. It confirmed the existence of the massive illegal Ponzi scheme and the $40 million in defaulted debt. It proved Richard was a financial predator operating on borrowed time. But without the routing numbers for the offshore shell accounts, the ledger was incomplete. If I handed this drive to the federal authorities, Richard's elite defense attorneys would claim the files were tampered with or misinterpreted. He would tie the investigation up in civil court for a decade, using his political connections to suppress the evidence, while he quietly moved his remaining assets out of the country. To execute the corporate squeeze, Apex Logistics needed to buy his defaulted debt and freeze his hidden assets simultaneously. I needed to prove the money in those offshore accounts belonged to Sterling Enterprises. I stared at the dead-end numerical codes on the glowing screen. The FBI had departments dedicated to tracing illicit funds through international banking channels, and even they struggled to pierce the veil of Cayman Island shell corporations. Richard had paid millions to construct a digital fortress around his stolen capital. How could I possibly trace Richard's hidden accounts when the FBI themselves could not find them? The glaring gaps in the spreadsheet mocked me. Rows of transferred capital simply vanished into blank cells. Richard Sterling had paid elite offshore accountants a fortune to scrub the destination data from his private servers. He had built a labyrinth of anonymous limited liability corporations to launder his diverted funds, effectively making the money disappear from the jurisdiction of the United States federal government. I drummed my fingers against the edge of the desk. Julianne stood silently near the door, recognizing the intense, quiet focus required to dismantle a billionaire's digital fortress. Richard was meticulous. He was ruthless. He covered his tracks with the precision of a seasoned predator. But predators who operate at the top of the food chain share a common fatal vulnerability: arrogance. My mind raced back to the shadowy corner of the St. Regis reception hall. I recalled the heavy scent of scotch and expensive cigar smoke. I remembered the cold, dismissive sneer on Richard's face as he reached inside his tailored Italian tuxedo. He had looked at me not as a legitimate threat, but as a minor nuisance, a lowly diner waitress who could be easily swatted away with a trivial sum of cash. He had been so profoundly confident in my ignorance, so certain that a poor, uneducated sister would never possess the financial literacy to understand the paper he handed her. I spun my chair away from the glowing monitor and reached for the simple, unbranded purse resting on my unmade bed. I popped the clasp and reached inside the zippered lining. My fingers brushed against a crisp, folded piece of thick, watermarked paper. I pulled the check out and unfolded it, smoothing the creases flat against my desk. $10,000. The amount was meaningless. The true value lay in the string of numbers printed across the bottom edge. When a man like Richard Sterling attempts to bribe someone to disappear from a highly publicized wedding, he does not write a personal check from his primary bank account. He does not want his wife, his business partners, or his internal corporate auditors questioning a sudden, unexplained payout to a working-class woman. He uses untraceable capital. He pulls the funds from an account disconnected from his public identity, a shadow account designed for discreet, unsanctioned transactions. I picked up my encrypted phone and dialed a direct, secure line. Marcus answered on the first ring. The background noise indicated he was already in the Apex Logistics Executive Command Center in downtown Salt Lake City. "We have a breach protocol ready," Alice Marcus reported, his voice crisp and professional. "The acquisitions team is standing by. What are we hunting?" "I need you to run a cross-reference query against the encrypted ledgers I just uploaded to the secure server I instructed. Target the fragmented transfer codes associated with Sterling Enterprises' defaulted commercial bridge loans." "I see the fragmented data," Marcus replied, the rapid clacking of a mechanical keyboard echoing over the line. "The destination routing sequences are entirely scrubbed. We are looking at a dead end. Whoever built this firewall knew exactly what they were doing." I stared down at the crisp paper resting on my desk. "They built a strong wall, Marcus, but the architect just handed me the master key." I read the obscure 9-digit routing number printed at the bottom of the $10,000 check. I followed it with the lengthy, complex account sequence. "Run those numbers," I commanded. A tense silence stretched over the secure line. The only sound was the rhythmic hum of Marcus's keystrokes as he inputted the data into the Apex Analytics software. Richard Sterling believed he was invincible. He had constructed a massive financial fraud leveraging his public properties to secure high-risk capital and funneling the stolen money into shadow accounts to project an illusion of vast wealth. He thought his secrets were buried deep beneath layers of impenetrable legal and digital armor. But his massive ego had demanded he personally deliver the final, humiliating blow to the waitress standing in the shadows. He wanted the visceral satisfaction of watching me take his bribe. In his arrogant haste to assert dominance, he had used a check linked to the very shadow accounts he had spent millions to hide. He had essentially handed me a map detailing the exact location of his buried treasure. "I have a hit," Marcus announced, his professional tone fracturing slightly with disbelief. "The routing sequence you provided is a direct conduit to a primary holding account registered in the Cayman Islands. It is listed under a blind trust, but the transaction timestamps align perfectly with the scrubbed transfer dates on the Sterling ledgers. Can you trace the linked accounts?" I asked, leaning closer to my monitor as new windows began to populate the screen. "The firewalls are dropping," Marcus confirmed. "The routing number acted as a bypass protocol. I am seeing the entire network now. Alice, this is staggering. Lines of raw, undeniable data flooded my encrypted terminal. The blank cells in Julianne's stolen ledgers rapidly filled with international banking codes, exact dollar amounts, and offshore wire transfer receipts. The sheer magnitude of the financial fraud was laid bare in harsh, undeniable text. Richard Sterling had systematically diverted over $40 million in secured loan capital into these hidden shell companies. He was entirely bankrupt on paper, operating a massive illegal Ponzi scheme to keep his real estate empire afloat. He was a fake billionaire balancing on a fragile house of cards, using his daughter's pristine credit and his elite country club connections to secure new loans to pay off the old ones. "We have him," Alice Marcus said, the fierce satisfaction evident in his voice. "The evidence is irrefutable. Federal tax evasion, wire fraud, and grand larceny. If we hand this data package to the FBI White-Collar Division, Richard Sterling will be in federal custody by Tuesday morning." I looked at the screen, watching the damning numbers scroll past. A cold, quiet resolve settled over me. Handing the file to the federal authorities would ensure Richard went to prison. But it would be a slow, bureaucratic death. He would use his remaining political connections to secure bail. He would drag the investigation out for years, sitting comfortably in his Park City mansion, while high-priced defense attorneys tied the prosecution in knots. He would continue to terrorize Julianne and Leo, using his remaining influence to ensure the pediatric clinic grant remained frozen, and the brutal $250,000 lawsuit bled us dry in civil court. I did not want a slow, bureaucratic death for Richard Sterling. I wanted a total, instantaneous, public execution of his legacy. I wanted to pull the floor out from under him so quickly he would not even have time to scream. "Do not alert the authorities yet, Marcus," I instructed, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. There was a brief pause on the line. "What is the play?" Marcus asked, recognizing the shift in my tone. Richard Sterling built his entire life on the assumption that money buys invincibility. I said, picking up the watermarked check and sliding it back into my purse. He loves leverage. He loves owning the ground people stand on. Let us show him what true leverage looks like. I stood up from the desk, the soft cotton of my faded canvas jacket rustling in the quiet room. Julianne watched me, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and profound hope. "Prepare the elite acquisitions team, Marcus," I commanded. "We are going shopping." With the ultimate weapon officially in my hands, how would I initiate the massive corporate squeeze? I closed the encrypted laptop, the sudden darkness mirroring the cold calculation settling over my mind. I turned to face Julianne. She stood near the doorway, her hands tucked into the pockets of the oversized hoodie. The terrified bride had been replaced by a young woman witnessing the swift, brutal dismantling of her toxic lineage. "Stay here," I told her softly. "Tell Leo to cancel the search for a defense attorney. The lawsuit is dead. The grant will be restored by tomorrow morning." How she asked, her voice hushed. "How can you be so certain? Because by tomorrow morning?" I replied, walking past her into the narrow hallway. "Richard Sterling will not own the pen required to sign a legal document." I left the apartment, stepping back out into the crisp Sunday afternoon air. I did not return to the faded sedan parked under the watchful eye of Richard's private investigator. That phase of the illusion was complete. The investigator could sit in his unmarked SUV for the rest of the week, reporting back to a billionaire who was about to cease existing. I walked 2 blocks down the street, turning the corner into a discreet, private parking garage. Resting in a reserved spot was a sleek black corporate SUV with heavily tinted windows. I climbed into the back seat, opening a secure tablet mounted into the leather console. The digital link to Marcus was already active. "Initiate Phase 2, I commanded my voice, projecting crisp authority into the quiet cabin. "Deploy the acquisition teams immediately." "I see the green lights across the board," Alice Marcus replied. "The commercial lenders holding Sterling Enterprises paper are desperate to offload the liability. Richard has missed 3 consecutive quarterly interest payments on his primary construction loans for the Park City developments. The banks know he is drowning. They just do not know the extent of the fraud yet. They are terrified of a total default," I noted, scanning the glowing market data populating my screen. Richard has been projecting the image of an untouchable real estate mogul, throwing lavish weddings and bullying hospital boards to maintain the facade of extreme wealth. But behind the velvet ropes, he is running a Ponzi scheme. He used Julianne's pristine credit history to co-sign new, high-risk federal loans, intending to use that fresh capital to cover the interest on the old debts. But Julianne walked out of the St. Regis. She severed the financial lifeline. "He is bleeding out," Marcus confirmed, "and the sharks in the lending sector smell it. Buy the debt, Marcus. All of it." I watched the digital indicators flash on my tablet as Apex Logistics mobilized. I did not haggle over the price. I instructed my team to offer the commercial banks a generous premium, purchasing Richard's toxic debt portfolios in pure liquid cash. It was a transaction designed for breathtaking speed. In the cutthroat world of corporate finance, liquid cash moving on a Sunday afternoon bypasses red tape and bureaucratic hesitation. The lenders eagerly signed over the promissory notes, thrilled to escape the impending implosion of Sterling Enterprises. Within exactly 3 hours, the complex, staggering transfer of ownership was finalized. The legal, electronic signatures stamped across the digital ledgers. Apex Logistics became the sole, undeniable owner of Richard Sterling's entire fraudulent empire. We did not just own the paper. We owned the literal ground beneath his luxury Park City developments. We held the primary mortgage on the sprawling Sterling estate. We controlled the commercial leases for the corporate offices where his ruthless attorneys drafted their predatory lawsuits. I leaned back against the plush leather seat, closing my eyes for a brief moment. 15 years ago, a bank manager had looked at me with cold indifference and told me a 19-year-old girl could not challenge the system. Today, I owned the system. 20 miles away, inside the sun-drenched sunroom of the Sterling estate, the celebration of my fabricated demise came to a sudden, violent halt. I could easily imagine the chaotic scene unfolding. Richard likely sat in his leather armchair swirling expensive scotch, thoroughly convinced his legal terror campaign had successfully pushed the poor, uneducated sister to the brink of total bankruptcy. Victoria was likely scrolling through the toxic comments on her Instagram feed, reveling in the digital destruction of Julianne's social standing. Then, Richard's secure personal phone began to ring. It was not a congratulatory call from a golf course buddy or a sycophantic politician. It was a frantic, terrified call from his primary account manager at the commercial bank. I could picture the blood rapidly draining from Richard's arrogant face as the banker stammered through the explanation. The loans had been sold. The debt was transferred. The massive, crushing liability keeping Sterling Enterprises afloat was no longer held by a pliant, predictable local bank. It had been abruptly bought out by a ruthless, unknown private equity firm operating with staggering aggressive speed. Richard Sterling's fake legacy was crumbling to ash right in front of his eyes. The panic would be instantaneous and suffocating. A man who built his entire life on the assumption that money buys invincibility was suddenly stripped of his armor. He was entirely trapped, backed into a terrifying financial corner. He knew the unknown equity firm now held the power to demand immediate, full repayment of the defaulted loans. He knew that when he failed to produce the $40 million he had secretly funneled into the Cayman Islands shell accounts, the firm would legally seize his properties, his business, and his home. He was drowning, gasping for a lifeline in an ocean he no longer controlled. He was desperately waiting for the ultimate death blow to strike. As I monitored the finalized acquisition data on my tablet, a quiet chime echoed in the secure cabin. It was an alert from the specialized tracking software Marcus had installed on Richard's private server during the breach. "Richard is scrambling," Marcus reported over the secure line. "He is attempting to initiate an emergency wire transfer from his Cayman Shadow accounts, trying to pull liquid capital back into the States to cover the exposed debt." "Let him try," I replied, my voice cool and detached. "Did the freeze hold?" Marcus let out a short, sharp laugh. "The offshore accounts are locked down tight. Using the routing numbers from the bribe check, we initiated a shadow hold. He cannot move a single dime without triggering an international fraud alert. The money is frozen in the digital ether." Richard was officially paralyzed. He could not access his stolen funds. He could not secure new loans. The walls of his gilded cage were rapidly closing in. He was a man accustomed to holding all the cards, suddenly realizing he was sitting at a table where he did not even own the chair. I stared at the glowing screen of my tablet, the culmination of a decade of relentless ambition, culminating in this singular, decisive moment. The physical destruction of his business was secured. The financial strangulation was complete. But simply foreclosing on his properties was not enough. Taking his money would hurt him, but it would not provide the profound, visceral justice required to balance the scales for the pain he had inflicted on my family. Richard Sterling needed to look his executioner in the eye. He needed to fully comprehend the sheer magnitude of his fatal miscalculation. He needed to understand that the poor, uneducated sister he banished to the shadows was the exact entity dismantling his world. To achieve that level of poetic devastation, I needed to lure the arrogant tycoon out of his heavily mortgaged mansion and into a controlled environment. I needed him to willingly walk into the trap, propelled by the very arrogance that had blinded him. I opened a blank, highly secure corporate email draft. I typed out a single, precise message addressed directly to Richard's private inbox. I carefully crafted the wording, designing the communication to appeal to his massive, fragile ego. I offered him a lifeline, a golden ticket out of the crushing debt that was currently suffocating him. I presented an illusion of salvation, knowing his desperate, greedy nature would compel him to grasp it. I hit send, launching the digital bait across the network. What terrifying bait would I dangle to lure the arrogant tycoon out of his mansion? The secure email bypassed the standard spam filters of Sterling Enterprises, landing directly in Richard's highly guarded, private inbox. The subject line was drafted to command immediate attention. Urgent corporate acquisition offer, Apex Logistics. I monitored the digital delivery receipt on my tablet from the quiet interior of my SUV. The notification blinked green. He opened it. Marcus confirmed over the secure channel. The scene inside the Sterling estate was entirely predictable. Richard was likely pacing his mahogany-paneled home office like a caged predator. His commercial bankers had just informed him that his massive, toxic debt portfolios had been bought out by an unknown entity. He was actively suffocating under the realization that $40 million in defaulted loans were now controlled by a stranger. He had tried and failed to access his hidden Cayman Island accounts. The panic of impending bankruptcy, federal investigation, and total social ruin was closing around his throat. Then the email arrived. I could visualize Richard throwing his heavy frame toward his computer monitor, his eyes scanning the crisp, professional text. The email did not read like a foreclosure notice. It read like a monumental, highly lucrative, corporate rescue package. The message explicitly stated that the anonymous CEO of Apex Logistics had been quietly monitoring the real estate market in Park City. It detailed a profound interest in the unique properties controlled by Sterling Enterprises. The email proposed a massive, generous buyout of the $40 million in commercial debt, offering to inject fresh capital and completely restructure the failing loans, effectively saving the Sterling Empire from imminent collapse. It concluded with a formal invitation. The CEO of Apex Logistics requested an immediate, exclusive VIP dinner meeting at the Alpine Summit, the most ridiculously expensive Michelin star restaurant in downtown Salt Lake City, to formally discuss the terms and finalize the rescue contracts that very evening. The dramatic irony of the situation was absolute. The man reading the email genuinely believed a brilliant, mysterious billionaire investor had recognized his immense value and was throwing him a golden lifeline. He had no idea the lifeline was a noose, and the billionaire holding the rope was the exact same woman he had banished to a dark corner by a catering kitchen 48 hours earlier. The tracker Marcus installed on Richard's system registered a sudden spike in activity. Richard let out a loud, hysterical roar of pure joy that undoubtedly echoed through the sprawling, heavily mortgaged halls of his mansion. He slapped his hands against his mahogany desk, the terrifying panic of the last 3 hours vanishing in an instant, replaced by a surge of toxic, unearned confidence. His massive, fragile ego instantly convinced him that his superior intellect and commanding presence had successfully snatched a miraculous victory from the jaws of total defeat. He did not question the sudden, generous offer. Narcissists rarely question why good fortune finds them. They simply assume they are entitled to it. He genuinely believed his fake high society charm had drawn a major player to the table. I watched the surveillance feed Marcus patched through from a camera positioned near the front gates of the Sterling estate. Within 20 minutes, the heavy oak doors of the mansion swung open. Richard strutted out, looking like a conquering king. He had discarded the wrinkled clothes of a stressed, drowning man and was now wearing a sharp, custom-tailored charcoal suit. He walked with a renewed, arrogant swagger, his chest puffed out, entirely convinced he was about to secure his legacy. Victoria followed closely behind him. She had clearly received frantic, joyful instructions from her husband to dress for an elite corporate seduction. She wore the exact same expensive custom emerald designer gown she had worn the night before the wedding. The heavy, conflict-free diamond choker rested against her collarbone, catching the late afternoon sun. She carried herself with the haughty, dismissive air of a woman who believed her social standing made her completely untouchable. They looked like royalty. They were, in reality, two entirely bankrupt frauds preparing to attend their own funeral. Richard opened the door of his sleek, imported luxury sedan, ushering Victoria inside before sliding behind the steering wheel. The engine roared to life, the tires crunching against the pristine gravel driveway. They drove past the heavy iron gates of their estate, happily and blindly steering straight toward a perfectly designed execution chamber. Alice Marcus said over the secure line breaking the quiet focus in my SUV. Target vehicle is on the move. Estimated time of arrival at the Alpine Summit is 45 minutes. Understood, I replied, closing the tablet. I need you to confirm the final legal preparations. Are the transfer contracts ready? The documents are flawless, Marcus assured me. They outline an unconditional, non-negotiable transfer of all controlling shares in Sterling Enterprises, along with the physical deed to the Park City estate directly to Apex Logistics. The language is ironclad. If he signs, he walks away with nothing but the clothes on his back, but he avoids immediate federal prosecution for the offshore tax evasion. He will sign, I stated coldly. Men like Richard Sterling value their physical freedom over their pride, especially when the pride is already broken. I tapped the partition separating the back seat from the driver. Take me to the Alpine Summit, I instructed. The drive through the winding mountain roads into downtown Salt Lake City was smooth and uneventful. I watched the fading sunlight cast long shadows across the valley. 15 years of grueling labor, calculated risks, and unwavering discipline had culminated in this evening. I had built an empire in the shadows, specifically to protect my brother from the corrupting influence of wealth. And now I was using that same empire to destroy the people who had tried to crush him. The black SUV pulled up to the discreet private VIP entrance at the rear of the Alpine Summit. The restaurant was famous for its exclusivity, requiring reservations months in advance, and boasting a client list restricted to the ultra-wealthy and the politically connected. A tall, impeccably dressed security detail opened my door. I stepped out onto the polished pavement, smoothing the lapels of my custom-tailored obsidian suit. I did not look like the sister who wore an off-the-rack navy dress to a high-society wedding. I looked exactly like the apex predator I had become. I bypassed the bustling main dining room, escorted directly into the restaurant's most exclusive space. The VIP boardroom was a masterpiece of modern luxury and corporate intimidation. A massive rectangular table, carved from a single slab of dark imported wood, dominated the center of the room. High-backed premium leather chairs lined the sides. I walked to the head of the table and took my seat. I placed my thick leather financial portfolio onto the polished wood. I poured a glass of sparkling water from a crystal pitcher, leaning back in the commanding chair, allowing the velvet shadows of the room to settle around me. Outside in the grand lobby, the scene was set. The general manager of the Alpine Summit, a man who understood exactly who signed the checks that kept his establishment running, was waiting near the elevators. Richard and Victoria Sterling were currently ascending in the private glass elevator, ascending toward the top floor of the city, believing they were rising to meet their savior. They were expecting a mysterious billionaire investor, eager to hand them $40 million and validate their toxic existence. They were expecting salvation. What will happen when the elevator doors open at the exclusive restaurant and they see their savior? The silver doors of the private glass elevator glided open with a soft, melodic chime, revealing the opulent, softly lit lobby of the Alpine Summit. Richard and Victoria Sterling stepped onto the plush, hand-woven carpet. They moved with the synchronized, deliberate stride of a couple accustomed to parting crowds and demanding instant deference. Richard adjusted the cuffs of his tailored charcoal suit, his chin tilted upward, projecting the manufactured confidence of a mogul who had just secured his legacy. Victoria walked half a step behind him, the heavy diamond choker catching the ambient light, her emerald gown rustling softly against the floor. They looked like conquering royalty preparing to accept tribute from a wealthy, mysterious benefactor. Richard approached the polished marble host stand. He did not wait to be addressed. He placed his large hands flat on the cool stone surface, leaning forward slightly to assert physical dominance over the young, impeccably dressed host. "I'm Richard Sterling," he announced, his deep voice carrying easily across the quiet lobby. "I have a private dinner meeting scheduled in the VIP boardroom with the CEO of Apex Logistics. Escort my wife and me back there immediately." The host offered a polite, practiced smile. "Of course, Mr. Sterling. If you will just wait one moment in the lounge area, the general manager will be right with you to provide the escort." Richard's jaw tightened. He despised waiting. Waiting was a subtle exertion of power by an unknown entity, an early negotiation tactic he frequently used himself. He turned away from the host stand, signaling Victoria to follow him toward the elegant, velvet-lined seating area designated for arriving VIPs. They took exactly 3 arrogant steps down the polished hallway before the carefully constructed illusion of their evening shattered. Victoria stopped dead in her tracks. She let out a loud, sharp gasp, her manicured hands flying up to clutch the heavy diamonds at her throat. The sound was not a delicate expression of surprise. It was a theatrical, piercing noise of pure, unfiltered outrage that echoed through the sophisticated atmosphere of the restaurant lobby. "What in the world are you doing here?" Victoria shrieked, her voice losing its refined country club polish and pitching into an ugly, shrill register. Richard turned sharply, his brow furrowing in confusion. His eyes followed his wife's pointing, trembling finger. I sat comfortably on a deep, plush velvet sofa, positioned directly across from the elevators. I held a crystal glass of sparkling water resting one leg casually over the other. The cheap, off-the-rack navy dress from the wedding reception was a distant memory. I wore a razor-sharp $5,000 obsidian designer suit. The fabric draped flawlessly, projecting a cold, undeniable authority. My posture was relaxed, entirely devoid of the nervous, deferential energy they expected from the poor, uneducated sister they had banished to the catering kitchen shadows. I took a slow sip from my glass, meeting their horrified stares with a cool, level gaze. Richard's face underwent a rapid, terrifying transformation. The arrogant flush of anticipated victory drained away, instantly replaced by a deep, mottled purple of uncontrolled fury. He genuinely believed that the lower-class maid had somehow tracked his movements and stalked his family to the most exclusive restaurant in Utah to ruin his crucial billionaire bailout meeting. "You pathetic, deranged woman," Richard growled, marching aggressively toward my sofa. He pointed a thick, threatening finger directly at my face, attempting to use his massive physical size to intimidate me into submission. "I do not know how you bypass the security at the door, but this little stalking game ends right now. You are a highly disturbed individual." Victoria quickly moved to stand beside her husband, her face twisted in a mask of toxic elitism. She turned wildly toward the polished marble host stand, waving her arms in a frantic, demanding gesture. "You there," Victoria yelled at the young host, treating him like a lowly servant who had failed a basic task. "Call your security guards immediately. This woman is a dangerous ghetto opportunist who is actively stalking my family. I want her physically dragged out of this establishment and thrown onto the street this exact second." The host remained composed, his expression carefully neutral. "Ma'am, please lower your voice," he requested politely. "We do not tolerate harassment in this restaurant." Richard puffed out his chest, stepping closer to the host stand. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Richard bellowed, dropping the last shreds of his fake high society charm. "I am Richard Sterling. I am here to meet a billionaire investor who is injecting $40 million into my corporate portfolio tonight. If you do not have your armed guards remove this trash from the lobby right now, I will personally see to it that you lose your job, and I will have my political connections shut this entire establishment down by morning." They stood there in the center of the elegant lobby, throwing a highly toxic public temper tantrum. A few wealthy patrons waiting near the bar turned their heads, watching the chaotic spectacle unfold with morbid fascination. Richard and Victoria fully expected me to cower. They expected the restaurant staff to instantly comply with their demands, to grab my arms and violently eject me through the service doors, confirming their untouchable status. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to defend myself. I simply set my crystal glass down on the small marble coffee table and waited for the performance to conclude. The heavy frosted glass doors leading from the main dining room swung open. The general manager of the Alpine Summit stepped out into the lobby. He was a distinguished older gentleman who possessed an intricate understanding of true power in Salt Lake City. He knew exactly who signed the checks, who held the quiet leverage, and who was merely pretending. Victoria spotted the manager approaching. She straightened her posture, lifting her chin, preparing to unleash another barrage of entitled demands. "Thank goodness you are here," Victoria declared, her voice dripping with venom. "Your front desk staff is completely incompetent. This deranged woman is stalking us. Remove her immediately before our billionaire investor arrives and sees this filthy spectacle." The general manager did not apologize profusely. He did not signal the 2 tall security guards stationed near the entrance to grab my arms. He did not even look at Victoria. He treated the frantic, screaming socialite as if she were entirely invisible. He walked directly past the furious Sterling family. He bypassed Richard's imposing, aggressive stance without a second glance. The general manager stopped perfectly in front of my velvet sofa. He adjusted the lapels of his immaculate suit, placed his hands behind his back, and bowed with profound, genuine respect. "Right this way, Madam CEO," the manager announced, his voice steady, projecting clearly across the suddenly dead silent lobby. "Your private boardroom is fully prepared for the evening." The silence that followed his words was absolute and physically deafening. It was the kind of silence that occurs in the fraction of a second after a lightning strike, just before the thunder shatters the sky. The wealthy patrons near the bar froze their expensive wine glasses, hovering midway to their lips. The ambient noise of the restaurant seemed to vanish, sucked into the vacuum created by the sudden, violent reversal of power. I watched the realization hit Victoria first. Her mouth dropped open in an incredibly unattractive display of pure, unadulterated shock. The toxic elitism shattered, leaving her completely exposed. Her eyes darted wildly between the deferential general manager and the calm, collected woman sitting comfortably in the $5,000 designer suit. The poor, uneducated sister she had mocked and humiliated online was the person commanding absolute respect from the staff she had just tried to bully. But the true devastation was reserved for Richard. He stumbled a half-step backward, the polished heel of his expensive dress shoe catching awkwardly on the edge of the plush carpet. His broad shoulders sagged. The arrogant posture, the booming voice, the projected dominance of a self-made mogul all collapsed simultaneously. His desperate brain fought violently against the impossible reality unfolding in front of him, frantically trying to connect the terrifying dots. He remembered the watermarked check he had thrown onto the wobbly table by the catering kitchen. He remembered the swift, ruthless private equity firm that had bought his $40 million in defaulted debt just hours ago. He remembered the email from the anonymous CEO offering a corporate bailout. He looked at my tailored suit. He looked at the Boeing general manager. And then he looked directly into my eyes. The quiet, unassuming sister he had viciously banished to the shadows was the exact same multi-billionaire investor he was desperately begging for a corporate lifeline. He had happily, blindly, and arrogantly walked straight into a perfectly designed financial slaughterhouse, and he was currently staring at the butcher. I slowly stood up from the velvet sofa, casually buttoning the front of my obsidian blazer. I did not acknowledge Victoria's hyperventilating. I looked directly at the broken, terrified real estate tycoon. "After you, Richard," I said, gesturing politely toward the elegant hallway leading to the VIP dining rooms. "We have a massive amount of corporate business to discuss tonight." I turned away and began walking confidently down the corridor, closely followed by the general manager. The Sterling family had 2 choices. They could turn around, run out the front doors, and guarantee their total financial ruin when the commercial banks seized everything they owned by morning, or they could swallow their pride and obediently follow the very woman they had relentlessly abused into the execution chamber. The slow, heavy, terrified footsteps echoing behind me confirmed they had chosen the latter. How will Richard process the sheer, suffocating terror of his new reality? The journey down the softly lit corridor felt like a funeral procession for the Sterling Empire. The general manager guided us with practiced discretion, opening the heavy mahogany doors to the VIP boardroom. This brings us back to the exact moment my evening began, resolving the question of how I ended up waiting in the velvet shadows. I walked past the plush leather chairs, took my seat at the head of the long wooden table, and waited for my guests to enter. Richard and Victoria dragged their feet across the threshold. The wealthy, untouchable royalty of Park City had vanished, replaced by two hollow figures facing their own ruin. Richard pulled out a chair for his wife. His hands shook so visibly that his gold cufflinks rattled against the polished wood. Victoria collapsed into the seat, her emerald gown losing its luster in the dim light. She stared at the crystal water pitcher in the center of the table, as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. I unzipped my leather portfolio. The soft, metallic glide of the zipper echoed like a gunshot in the silent, soundproof room. I reached inside and withdrew 3 thick black binders. These were the forensic accounting dossiers Marcus and my elite acquisitions team had meticulously compiled over the past few hours. I placed my palms flat against the heavy covers and pushed them down the length of the table. They slid smoothly over the polished surface, coming to a halt directly in front of Richard's trembling hands. "Open them," I instructed, my voice calm, clinical, and devoid of pity. Richard swallowed hard, his throat bobbing above his tight silk tie. He reached out with unsteady fingers and flipped the cover of the first binder. His eyes darted across the pages, absorbing the harsh, undeniable data. I watched the remaining color drain from his face, leaving a sickly, ashen pallor. The documents detailed the exact routing numbers, the defaulted commercial bridge loans, and the illicit capital he had shuffled between unfinished properties. The second binder contained the wire transfer receipts from the Cayman Island shell companies. "You thought your offshore accounts were invisible," I said, leaning back in my commanding chair. "You paid elite accountants to scrub your digital footprint, but your arrogance betrayed you. You wanted to humiliate me at the wedding reception. You handed me a bribe check linked directly to your shadow ledgers. My analysts used your own routing numbers to bypass your digital firewalls. I now own your $40 million in debt, Richard. I own the ground beneath your luxury developments. I hold the primary mortgage on your sprawling estate." Victoria let out a guttural, wretched sob. The pristine, haughty socialite who had laughed at me near the catering kitchen vanished. Tears streamed down her cheeks, carrying dark streaks of expensive mascara and heavy foundation onto the pristine collar of her gown. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders heaving with the crushing weight of her ruined social standing. Richard sat paralyzed. His chest rose and fell in shallow, erratic pants. The illusion of his billionaire status was reduced to a stack of damning paperwork resting under his fingertips. Before the suffocating silence could fully settle over their despair, the brass handle of the boardroom door clicked. The heavy wood swung outward. Aunt Clara stepped into the room. She wore the same bright, obnoxious yellow designer dress from her treacherous social media broadcast. She carried an eager, greedy smile, clearly anticipating a lavish dinner filled with elite gossip and a generous reward for betraying her own niece on Instagram Live. Her heels clicked sharply against the hardwood floor, then stopped abruptly. Clara looked at Victoria, who was weeping uncontrollably into her palms. She looked at Richard, who was staring blankly at the forensic dossiers like a condemned prisoner. Finally, her gaze traveled up the length of the mahogany table and landed on me. She took in the tailored obsidian suit, the crystal water glass, and the posture of undeniable authority. Her eager smile froze, morphing into a mask of profound confusion and rising terror. Alice Clara whispered, her voice cracking under the strain, "What are you doing here?" I did not offer her a greeting. I did not raise my voice to express my 15 years of suppressed anger. I reached back into my portfolio and extracted a single, thin manila folder. I slid it across the table, sending it gliding until it stopped inches from Clara's rigid hands. "Pick it up, Clara," I commanded. She hesitated, her eyes darting toward the open door, her survival instincts urging her to run. But the sheer gravity of the room rooted her in place. She picked up the folder and flipped it open. Inside were high-definition copies of the life insurance policies our parents had left behind. Next to them were the forged beneficiary release forms bearing her handwriting, alongside the bank transfer receipts routing the stolen funds into her personal accounts. You stole $100,000 from a grieving teenager and an 11-year-old boy, I stated, my tone dropping to a glacial chill. You bought a suburban house while I scrubbed floors on the graveyard shift to feed your nephew. You thought the passage of time protected you. Clara nodded frantically, clinging to that legal technicality like a life raft. It is over, she stammered, backing away from the table, the folder shaking in her grasp. The law says it is too late. You cannot do anything to me now. You are mistaken, I replied, folding my hands together and resting them on the table. You did not just forge a local document. You used a federally insured bank to route stolen funds across state lines. That constitutes federal wire fraud. Under the discovery rule, the statute of limitations for concealed financial crimes does not begin until the fraud is officially uncovered by the victim. My corporate attorneys officially uncovered your forgery 3 hours ago. The clock just restarted. The bright yellow dress suddenly looked like a prison jumpsuit. Clara dropped the folder. The papers spilled across the floor, scattering over the hand-woven rug. You have exactly 24 hours to pack your bags and permanently leave the state of Utah, I told her. If you ever contact my brother again, if you ever show your face in Salt Lake City, I will hand that file directly to the white-collar division of the FBI. You will spend your twilight years in a federal penitentiary. Clara did not argue. She did not plead for family loyalty. She turned on her heel, shoved the heavy boardroom doors open, and sprinted down the hallway. The frantic clicking of her shoes faded into the distance, entirely eliminating the toxic traitor from our lives forever. The heavy doors swung shut, sealing the room once more. The brief interruption had stripped away any lingering hope Richard and Victoria might have harbored. They were isolated, cornered, and entirely at my mercy. And I had none left to give. I shifted my focus back to the disgraced real estate tycoon sitting at the opposite end of the table. He was a hollow shell, stripped of his leverage, his wealth, and his allies. But the execution was not yet complete. I had one final document waiting in my portfolio. What absolute, final, devastating ultimatum did I have waiting for the fake billionaire? I reached into the leather portfolio for the final time. I did not pull out another binder of forensic accounting or another list of offshore shell companies. I withdrew a single, crisp legal document printed on premium corporate paper. I slid it across the mahogany table. It stopped mere inches from Richard's shaking hands. I placed a silver fountain pen next to it. "Read the stipulations, Richard," I instructed, my voice echoing in the soundproof room. He blinked, trying to focus his bloodshot eyes on the text. The document was an unconditional, non-negotiable transfer of ownership. By signing the bottom line, he would surrender all controlling shares of Sterling Enterprises directly to Apex Logistics. The contract also included the physical deed to the sprawling Park City estate, transferring ownership of his home to my holding company to cover the defaulted bridge loans. "You are taking my home," Victoria sobbed, her voice a hollow, ragged sound. She clutched the edge of the table, her knuckles stark white against the dark wood. "You cannot take the house. Where will we go? We have standing in this community. We have friends. You have a mountain of fraudulent debt," I corrected, not sparing her a glance. "Your friends belong to your bank account. The bank account is gone." Richard stared at the signature line. He knew the alternative. If he refused to sign, my analyst would immediately forward the Cayman Island routing numbers to the white-collar division of the FBI. The federal authorities would seize his assets, freeze his remaining accounts, and indict him for tax evasion and wire fraud. The ensuing trial would be highly publicized, dragging his name through the mud, before ultimately sending him to a federal penitentiary for the rest of his natural life. He would trade his tailored Italian suits for a standard-issue prison uniform. He picked up the silver pen. His hands trembled so severely he could barely grip the metal barrel. The nib scratched against the thick paper, leaving a jagged, unsteady signature that bore no resemblance to the confident scrawl of the tycoon who had handed me a bribe just 2 days earlier. He dropped the pen. It clattered against the wood. The execution was finished. The Utah sun rose over the Wasatch Mountains the next morning, casting a golden light across the manicured lawns of the exclusive Park City neighborhood. The air was crisp and biting. It was exactly 8 o'clock when the heavy silence of the gated community was broken by the deep rumble of diesel engines. A fleet of commercial moving trucks rolled down the pristine street, followed closely by 3 marked police cruisers, with their lights flashing silently. I sat in the back of my parked SUV down the block, watching the scene unfold through the tinted glass. The police officers approached the towering front doors of the Sterling estate. They did not knock politely. They pounded on the heavy oak. When Richard opened the door, wearing a rumpled bathrobe and looking like a ghost of his former self, the lead officer handed him the formal eviction notice. The transfer of the deed had been processed at dawn by a judge. They were officially trespassing on private corporate property. Victoria emerged from the grand staircase. She had clearly not slept. Her hair was a tangled mess, and she wore a sheer silk robe over her nightgown. When she saw the uniformed officers and the moving crew marching into her foyer, carrying stacks of cardboard boxes, she lost whatever remained of her composure. She shrieked a piercing wail that echoed down the quiet street, drawing the immediate attention of her wealthy neighbors. Front doors opened up and down the block. People stepped out onto their pristine driveways, holding expensive coffee mugs, watching the spectacular downfall of the neighborhood royalty. The same people Victoria had tried to impress for decades were now silent witnesses to her ruin. The movers worked with swift, detached efficiency. They carried out designer furniture, expensive artwork, and racks of haute couture clothing, loading the remnants of a fractured dynasty into the back of the waiting trucks. Richard stood on the front lawn, his shoulders slumped, his eyes fixed on the pavement. He did not fight. He did not argue. He watched the empire he had built on lies crumble into the back of a moving van. But simply taking their house was an administrative victory. I wanted a resolution that addressed the specific cruelty they had inflicted at the wedding reception. As the movers carried the last of the heavy furniture out the front doors, a sleek white catering van pulled into the driveway. The side doors slid open. A team of servers stepped out wearing crisp white button-down shirts and black aprons. It was the exact same catering staff Victoria had berated, belittled, and treated like disposable servants at the St. Regis wedding just 2 nights prior. I had hired them for a private, highly compensated morning event. The servers set up a folding table right on the edge of the manicured lawn. They polished a row of crystal flutes and uncorked 3 bottles of premium vintage champagne. As the moving crew carried the final boxes out of the estate, wiping sweat from their brows, the servers walked among them. They offered the working men and women trays of chilled champagne to celebrate a job well done. Victoria stood on the sidewalk clutching her silk robe, watching the working-class people she had despised clink crystal glasses on her former lawn. The visual poetry of the moment was undeniable. The elite were left with nothing, while the people they considered beneath them raised a toast on the ashes of their vanity. The consequences of Richard's financial ruin extended far beyond a lost mansion. His legal team scrambled to arrange a bankruptcy restructuring to avoid the looming threat of federal prison. The court mandates were strict. To meet his designated restitution payments to his defrauded investors, the former billionaire was required to secure and maintain verifiable, legitimate employment. He could no longer hide behind anonymous shell companies or high society networking. He had to punch a clock and earn a paycheck. Through the vast network of Apex Logistics, I ensured his employment counselor found a suitable position. Richard Sterling, the man who used to dictate terms from a velvet-lined boardroom and smoke cigars while ruining lives, accepted a role as a minimum wage shift manager at a rural distribution warehouse on the outskirts of the state. There were no imported orchids or mahogany desks in his new world. His new reality consisted of glaring fluorescent lights, the relentless beeping of backing forklifts, and cold concrete floors. He wore a bright yellow safety vest. He answered to regional supervisors who cared only about shipping quotas and strict deadlines, lacking any interest in his former country club pedigree. He spent his days checking inventory logs, sweating in the poorly ventilated warehouse, and sweeping the loading docks. He learned the bitter, exhausting reality of the working-class life he had spent decades mocking. 3 weeks later, the air in my apartment felt lighter, cleared of the heavy dread that had shadowed us for days. Julianne sat at my kitchen table. This time there were no tears. She held a printed certificate in her hands. She had officially passed her real estate licensing exam. Free from the restrictive, toxic expectations of her parents, she was ready to build a career on her own merit, using her own name, earning her own commissions. She was glowing, radiant with the quiet pride of true independence. She did not need a trust fund or a fraudulent inheritance. She had her own drive and a family that supported her. Later that afternoon, I stood beside Leo in the bright, freshly painted reception area of a building in downtown Salt Lake City. The scent of new drywall and antiseptic cleaner filled the air. A sign above the reception desk read, Rivera Pediatric Clinic. The funding had been restored and doubled by an anonymous private equity grant from Apex Logistics. Leo wore his white coat, adjusting a stethoscope around his neck. He looked around the clinic, his eyes shining with the realization of a lifelong dream. Patients were already sitting in the waiting room. He was ready to heal people unburdened by the threats of arrogant men. We had stood in the dark corner of a luxury resort, told by cruel people that we did not belong. We did not beg for a seat at their gilded, rotting table. We burned their fake world to the ground. In its place, we built our own table, founded on genuine loyalty, unrelenting hard work, and the unshakable bond of family. Have you ever had to fiercely destroy a toxic person's fake reality to protect the people you love? Tell me your story in the comments below.